Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So, welcome to Dangerous Art and Danger Artists. My name is Julie Trébeau. I'm the managing director of the Artists at Risk Connection, ARC. We are an organization that safeguards the right to artistic freedom and ensure that artists and cultural professionals, can live and work safely everywhere. And we provide direct support, tailored support to endangered artists and cultural professionals. I'm very, very excited about this program today. No pressure, ladies. And I'm very also honored to have the joy to partner with Art at a Time Like This, the co-partner for this series of events with Anne, who is here, and Barbara, who is somewhere else, but will be there soon. So Art at a Time Like This is a non-for-profit that supports artists and creatives by presenting public art exhibition and program in direct response to social and political events. This is our second collaboration with ATLT, and we are very delighted to work with them again. This Dangerous Art and Danger Artists is an ongoing program, so it's really centered around the rise of censorship globally and in the United States. We started planning this event a year ago, a bit less than a year ago, and fortunately, we really think, like, as we are seeing things evolving in this country and elsewhere, that the issue is more and more pressing. So today is the launch of the program. We will be hosting a 2-day summit at BRIC in Brooklyn on Friday, June 7 and Saturday, June 8. So please check your program. It's on your seat. You will see there's an amazing lineup of artists who will talk and continue to talk about the topic. Before introducing our fantastic panelists for this conversation, I want to thank the independent New York team, especially Elizabeth D. and the entire team, who has been really amazing to organize with us those events. I also want to give a big shout out to my colleague Valentine Sargent, who is our editorial and communication guru, as I call her. She has done an amazing work. And we will not be here without our generous supporter. ARC thanks the Ellen Frankenthaler Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and on behalf of Art at a Time Like This, I would like to thank the New York State Council on the Art, the Glenn Mender Trust Company, and the Catering Family Foundation for their invaluable support. So please, as I say, see the programs to check out what's going on next. We have a last panel about social media. Don't delete art right after this one. So stay around if you have time, of course. And now I'm very pleased to introduce today's panel. So the second panel, program, Compromise and Action, participating in a global art world. I think it's a big topic. As art institutions operate in a world rife with censorship, this conversation will discuss how institutions are both targeted by censorship and the perpetrator of it, by interrogating institutional self-censorship and the critical work currently being done to reinvigorate cultural spaces. This discussion will signal the pitfall these institutions face and how they can use their platforms and resources to amplify the work of socially engaged artists. So I'm delighted to welcome our two distinguished art professionals to this discussion, Tania Khoury and Laura Raicovich. Tania is a live artist whose work focuses on audience interactivity and its political potential. She's a distinguished artist in residence of theater and performance and the director of the Center for Human Rights and the Art at Bard College in New York. Laura Raicovich is a New York City-based writer and curator. A recent book, Culture Strike, Art and Museums in an Age of Protest was published in 2021 by Verso Books and is being translated into Arabic, Portuguese, and Italian. She's also the editor of Pro Dispatch, a digital publication featuring artists' takes on the local and global conditions that make their work necessary. You can read about Tania and Laura, full bio on your program, and that I hope you will join the conversation right after Laura and Tania start the discussion. Please welcome Tania and Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. Thank you for coming. And I just, before we begin in earnest, I want to acknowledge that we're standing today, or sitting, as it were, on Lenape lands that have never been ceded, and that it is a great privilege that I have to live and work in this landscape. And I acknowledge the Lenape people, past, present, and future, who have cared for this space since time immemorial. I'd like to kind of kick off this conversation with why I care about cultural space, because I think that what we're confronting is a particularly important moment in time when we're all looking at the different structures that surround us and the biases that are embedded in them, and questioning whether they function for us, whether they function for other people, and hopefully some of us are thinking about how we can make them better. And one of the reasons that cultural space is meaningful to me is because those institutions that present culture in one way or another are the spaces where, theoretically anyway, the imagination is cultivated. Of course, these spaces also are profound reflections of the society in which we live and operate, which has its very own specific biases and problems. And so it makes sense to me that those institutions reflect the very same problematics that we see unfolding every day. And so as a way to kind of approach larger systemic change, to me, and maybe it's because I just know these spaces because I've worked in them for over 20 years, that it makes sense to me to see what the capacity for change of these spaces is, and not to paint too broad a brush stroke over them, but they're all very different, right? Like the Met is really different from Recess or Laundromat Project, and we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about institutions. We're not always talking about the same type of institution with the same capacities one way or another. So because institutions are such a mirror of society, how do we approach them? How do we understand them? And how do we work within or outside of them? And I think today, we're looking at a universe in which there's a genocide unfolding in Gaza, there's violence and war in many geographies across the planet, and particularly in the United States as a response to the situation and the violence in Gaza specifically. Thousands and thousands of students are protesting and really making a very significant statement, I think, on university and college campuses across the country. And so I thought, Tania, maybe given the fact that you are working right now inside one of these colleges that is obviously connected to this larger conversation very directly, that maybe we should start by talking about that context.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think I want to start by responding not just as a faculty at a US college, but also as being myself a war child and a mother of a Palestinian child who is, like many of you right now, are seeing people who look very much like my family being displaced, famined, and crushed into their homes by the most sophisticated US weaponry. I just want to acknowledge that because I feel like as an artist and as a person, I am forever changed by what I'm witnessing. And bearing witness is something that has been very important for me as an artist, because I was always kind of preoccupied by how I invite audience to bear witness to other people's realities, other people's politics, in kind of creating forms that are intimate, that are multisensorial, where, unlike the simple spectating or watching from a distance, but really becoming part of the work and in a work that I create as an artist, and thinking about what that means for the audience, like how when they bear witness, they also hold this political responsibility towards doing something. And I think we're seeing lots of people around the world actually acting from that political responsibility of bearing witness. We're seeing artists, we're seeing medical doctors who have gone, volunteered, and came back to tell the world what happened in Gaza, like the absolute hero, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, who's now being banned from all Schengen states in Europe, just as the person who witnessed atrocities and is able to talk to them from the medical field. We have seen, students, both high school student and college student around the world rising up because they also bear witness. And it was remarkable for me as an artist to see that the art world was the first one to silence people for their solidarity with Palestine. We saw, retrospectives being canceled, like what happened to the pioneer artist Sami Halabi. We've seen people being disinvited to their own award ceremonies, like Adania Shibli, Vivian Sansour. We've seen art venues beloved by their communities being shut down, like Uyun in Berlin. And it's not just also Arab and Palestinian spaces and artists. We've seen Jewish artists who showed anti-Zionist or anti-colonial views being silenced, like Mashak Essen, Eyal Weizman, Beatrice Candice Betts, and Native American artists have also, I think, bared the brunt in the art world. Just yesterday, I would like to acknowledge a particularly young Vietnamese artist in the US. In Miami, the Elite Arts Board of Directors in South Beach made the decision to remove the artwork, a gentle, beautiful artwork of a young artist named Vu Hoang Nguyen, without their consent, without even their knowledge, because it uses a Palestinian chant for liberation in a work. And the students, the movement of Students for Justice in Palestine that we've seen significantly grow in the last months, we know it has been demonized by the US government. It was vilified by mainstream media. It was countered by police and riot gears who broke down, dismantled an otherwise not only peaceful protest, but in my view, an exemplary one. A one that felt like a liberated micro-society where they taught each other important things, revolutionary poetry, environmental justice, medical apartheid, history of displacement, and US imperialism. And I feel like I was fortunate to experience some of that in the college that I'm part of, at Bard, but also elsewhere. And I can account that these learning from student-led teachings has been one of the most kind of fruitful experience of my educational life, because I saw that how the students have managed to dismantle those power dynamics in those spaces and have managed to actually model the politics that they learn in class, but also that they aim for. And I wish for us to discuss as a group later on, how can we, within art institutions and outside them, actually be able to model or practice the politics that we care about. And I just want to bring it back to Laura and just also acknowledge that this activism on Palestine, as well as its criminalization, is not new to the West. And you yourself have been a victim of the, PEP. For those of you who don't know, PEP means Progressive Accept Palestine, which is really rooted in anti-Palestinian racism. So I'd like to ask you if you would be okay sharing what unfolded with you in 2017 during your role as a president of the Queen's Museum.
Thanks, Tania. It's a really long story, but I will make it a summary version and give you the highlights, because I think it's important to understand that a lot of the conversations that we have about censorship and also self-censorship don't unfold necessarily within public views, and that they're not necessarily visible at the time they're unfolding, in part because there's a great amount of vulnerability on many levels. And so when I resigned from the Queen's Museum in the winter of 2018, it was after almost a year's worth of struggle with only a very few people on the board of the museum. It was not a this wasn't like the whole board was lined up against me. It was like a really tiny minority that really shifted things. And it began with the conversations that unfolded at the museum in the wake of the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and the immigrant rights work that the museum had been very much connected to for a long time before I was there, and the work that we had done in solidarity with and in partnership with very many recent immigrant communities that surrounded the museum. And so the position that we had at the time, or that I had, and I was very clear about, and that the staff and I worked on as a group, as a team, was that it was important in this moment, especially with 20% of the staff potentially being affected by Donald Trump's revocation of DACA, that we work to be sure that there was actual understanding that we were not an arm of the state as a museum that functions out of a big building in the middle of a public park, but that it was clear what the values were. And alongside kind of restating our values and making some proposals to be very actively clear about our position, there were a number of people on the board who thought that clarity was misplaced. And that became even more of a problem when the Israeli mission to the United Nations proposed doing an event that celebrated a number of different votes that took place at the United Nations in 1947 that paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel. And the mission had wanted to host this event at the Queen's Museum's building because of the history of that building. From 1946 to 1950, the UN actually met in that building. And so that's why they were interested in having this event there, because some of those votes literally took place in that space, but also because they knew that the actual UN would never say yes, right? Like this would not be something the UN could possibly do. So we were the default backup because it was presumed that they could use their influence to make it happen there. And I was opposed to hosting this event. They wanted to do it as an event rental. It was a way, which was a way for the Queen's Museum to earn income. And we asked them for a proposal of what they were, as we would for any other organization. And it became clear that Mike Pence, 5 months in advance, would be their keynote speaker. Never mind that they were planning this event that was a really, really like profoundly troubling to me. And so I couldn't imagine hosting the event. I thought there were so many issues, from security questions to, well, just the nature of the event, the fact that Mike Pence was going to be there, like all of the above. And I also, what primarily concerned me, or one of my primary concerns, was that the fact that there was that we knew that the Vice President of the United States was going to be coming to the Queen's Museum on a particular date at a particular time 5 months in advance. And I was coming from the context where I couldn't get a local city council member to commit to coming like next Friday, never mind the Vice President of the United States. So I was like, what is going on here? Like, there is something bigger than what is being said, than what is being communicated, than this, like dopey proposal that has been given to me. And anyway, the board eventually agreed that this was not something that we should do, but they insisted that I be the person that can tell the ambassador that we were turning down their event. Which was, in my view, inappropriate, because really the board chair should have been the person to communicate with the ambassador. I mean, it was just like protocol-wise, it would make sense. Nonetheless, I was unable to prevail, and so I was the person who communicated to the ambassador. He was very upset, and basically told me, I mean, not in so many words, but he said he was going to get me, basically. There was 2 days later, there was an article in the Jerusalem Post, all but literally calling me an anti-Semite, saying that I needed to be removed for not approving this event. The board never clarified that I wasn't the one who made the decision, that it was them who made the decision, and that asked me to communicate their choice to the powers that be. They then immediately reinstated the event once they saw the social media chaos that followed. I was getting, death threats. There were threats made to follow my child to school and kidnap him. I was inundated with really powerful threats of violence. I basically went into shock, and my husband, who's Jewish, was like, you have to tell people that, I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors, that you and your grandmother helped Jews and partisans escape across the border of northern Italy. And I was like, this is insane that I would have to explain to a group of people who have known me for years at this point that I'm not an anti-Semite because I did not support the creation, the unfolding of this event at the Queen's Museum, which was so inappropriate for so many other reasons. And I felt so vulnerable, and I silenced myself. It was a choice because I needed to protect myself and my family. But I also knew that in the aftermath of all of this, once the event actually unfolded at the museum, which it did, and Mike Pence, yes, he came, and I insisted on being there because there was no way I wasn't going to bear witness to this insanity. He gave a 45-minute policy speech explaining that the U.S. was going to be moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The announcement, the first public announcement of that policy change, happened at the Queen's Museum. So that was the greater, shenanigans that were underway. And that was something specifically that was happening between Netanyahu and Trump. And that's why I didn't want to be a part of it, because I knew there was some shadiness that was unfolding beyond what you could see. So, I think the thing that I really want to say about this is not, and at the time it felt like there was no way to be able to say any of this in public, even marginally. I even think saying it now feels very, I feel very naked. But I think that this is a time that we have to be speaking these things out loud, because the more that we speak to them and talk about the realities and the violence that is being inflicted upon us and how unfree we actually are right now, is wild. And I was having, yesterday evening, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's Palestinian and whose cousin was just killed recently, and he lives here. And he was saying, you know, the solidarity that's come forward around Palestine in the United States is really remarkable, given the history and many other things. But the reality is that that people who are living in the United States need to be fighting for their own freedoms as well. This isn't just about, like, Palestine is everywhere in this sense of us needing to link our causes, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because we have no choice if we want to maintain some methodology or avenue to freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of life. Yeah? So I guess, sorry, this was a longer explanation than I intended, but I think it's important to be said. And I wondered, Tania, if within your universe, the way that you've had to operate inside and outside institutions, if you've experienced this kind of, or on what levels you've experienced the weight of this kind of censorship or threat.
Thank you for sharing this. I know it's not easy, but I agree that it's very important to actually kind of share how some of these have been weaponized inside the art world. Bard College is actually my first institutional job, and I was very much invited as an outsider. I was invited as an artist to create an institution within an institution, and that's the Center for Human Rights and the Arts, and two of our graduates are here, so they can talk about it. So this was only interesting to me if I would be given the space and the ability to build something that really is what I dream of in institutions. And you know, Bard is a small liberal art college that prides itself to have progressive politics and be very much focused on civic engagement. And it's true, it is actually, at the end of the day, more you know, forgiving of radical politics than most of other colleges, but it's not immune of the bureaucracy that holds usually a lot of this colonial power in white institutions. So I want to give a couple of examples that my personal battles, especially in the first couple of years, have been very much about creating an artist-centric ways of working, but also a non-American-centric ways of working, especially when we work globally with people like activists and artists around the world. And, you know, this included, for example, that we create work agreements that ensure that an institution will not hold on to commissioned work, especially work by people of color, so they don't, like, in 40 years end up actually owning work that they commissioned, video work or other objects. And this also included ways of practicing decentralization of funding that I personally would have wished to have in my work as an artist. And this came like to the dismay of a number of accountants and lawyers who did not like that. But for me, I insisted that I will not actually use the fact that money was channeled through the center as a way to exercise power on other people and collaborators. I did not want to see how they, you know, reporting on their budget. I didn't want to see how they decide to actually report. I wanted it to be built on community building, on shared trust, yeah, it was, I would say it generated lots of interesting conversations where, you know, thread saying like, what is this? What is she doing? Yeah, I'm happy to report that so far I won all these battles, and I am managing to really, again, what we discussed at the beginning, to have a small space where we can practice the politics that we care about, not only as, you know, intellectual jargon, but really in the everyday life, in how we write a contract, in how we ask people to be creative in how they report to us, rather than like, show me every receipt. Yeah, and I wanna actually turn it back to you and ask if this is kind of your experience in creating something right now from scratch with your friends, and that's the Francis Kite Club.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought the Francis Kite Club up, because I think one of my frustrations with being in institutional life and also coming out of the isolation of the pandemic was to really think about alternative cultural infrastructures that can support the kind of world building that I want to be doing. And, you know, I was very lucky to kind of connect with a group of friends who were all working in kind of this interesting Venn diagram of art, film, music, you know, universes that overlapped kind of beautifully. And we basically said, okay, well, if we have to deal with capitalism as such, let's make it work for us. And what about if we, you know, have a bar where we make the drinks cheap enough that you can get like a $5 beer, and, you know, it's a place most people can afford. And people know how to deal with a bar. Like, you know, the protocols, you know, it's not this like negotiating the front desk, like what the heck am I supposed to do if I've never been to a museum before? This is not as much of a speed bump. And one of the things I realized is that, you know, there's a lot of interest in producing social projects within museums and classical cultural spaces, but it's actually really hard to do that, right? It's really a challenge. And so, you know, how sometimes you're just fighting against the like sheer physicality of it. And I'm not saying that anything that I could do at the Queen's Museum, I could do at the Kite. That's just ridiculous. I mean, it's a bar. And there are a lot of things that shouldn't happen there for all kinds of good reasons. But there are things that can happen there in ways that I didn't have access to before. So it's another way of experimenting. And for me, I think, you know, I've never really fit in anywhere. I'm kind of like an in-between. Like, there's no place there's no zone in which I particularly make sense. I feel like the place I've made the most sense is in the bar, so come visit me there. But I think this desire for sociality and for being together maybe, you know, not in this space, not in the slightly stilted kind of hard to be social space of the classical cultural institution, but rather to maybe use a social space to recognize that culture is unfolding all the time, and we're all making culture all the time, and that we're not actually needing to go into a museum to have a cultural experience. And for me, that's an equally important piece of the puzzle. Yeah, I think maybe we should take some questions. I
mean, we have a lot to
we
discuss
could go on for like hours, but I think we want to hear from you too, because I know we have to tie up at 3, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little. Okay. Oh, okay.
But she had a question, so.
Yeah, let's go to that, and we can always go back and forth.
Okay, I got it.
Well, I have a question that kind of goes off of what, is it Khoury? Is that how you say your name?
Yeah.
Ms. Khoury was saying about how these student protests were laterally organized as opposed to a top-down organization. We know from especially the art world, the fine art world, it's very much organized from a top-down approach, right? And it's also a very finite audience, right? So what fine art reaches is much smaller than, say, an art that's been democratized like film. How do we go about building spaces that are much more laterally organized, side to side, as opposed to top down with financial structures being what they are?
I mean, I think that was precisely what the attempt has been with the kite. And part of what we're very much interested in doing there is not having a specific, I mean, things are unfolding there in music, in film, in art. And we're not necessarily interested in, as the collective of the five of us who run the place, like, we're not necessarily interested in being the only people who do that program. Like, you're all invited, just propose something. There's a form on our website, you can propose something, and if the questions don't make sense to you, skip those. But like, we look at all the proposals every 2 weeks and review them and, you know, figure it out. But, you know, I think part of what we want to do is have it be a collectively used and built space so that it's actually important. Its survival isn't just important to us because we started it, it's like becomes important to many other people for the reasons they want to be there, not just the reasons I want to be there. So, you know, I think there's a different kind of point of departure around something like that. It also depends on people, like, as a financial structure, in order to make rent, we need people to buy drinks. Like, that's a very basic, simple exchange, you know? And some people are gonna wanna go there and buy drinks and hang out and be a part of it and plan things for it. And some people just go there for a drink, and that's totally fine. Or go there because they like the band that's playing next Friday night, or the DJ that's playing next Saturday. You know, like, you know, I think we need to understand that we can produce things at a much different scale than what is being presented in these other kinds of cultural spaces. And I'll just say another thing just about money, because I think what you're pointing to is the money problem, which, as we know, is like a major issue on the top-down piece, which is that I recently wrote an op-ed with my colleague and friend Laura Hanna, who's an artist and filmmaker, and one of my collaborators at the Kite, and we wrote about kind of thinking about cultural infrastructure as people and buildings, yes, but people who make the work happen, and that needs to be thought of in a way that's really wildly different from a funding perspective, so that people can get paid a living wage, so that people can get health insurance, all of the things. But that part of that, the part of the way that's funded now, as we know, is privately, because the United States doesn't have a Ministry of Culture. We don't have really cultural policy to speak of outside of the very local level, but on a federal level that doesn't really exist. So what would happen if we had a source of public funds that comes from all of us to balance the private funds that already fund cultural spaces? And what if some of that cultural infrastructure supported things that didn't only look like the museums and cultural spaces that exist, but things that we want to invent, or things that we already participate in that just don't qualify as, you know, the types of organizations or entities, you know, whether maybe they're not a nonprofit. That's an idea, you know, like the nonprofit structure is so heavily dependent on the structures that exist that are so deeply problematic. You know, maybe there's new ways we need to be organizing on that level too. It's not just about getting people to donate to other things. It's about, as you're saying, like reinventing that whole relationship.
I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think it is essentially a question of money, and it's hard to do it in a place where there is no public funding at all in the art. But I've seen it, if it's helpful, I mean, from my point of view, from what I can do, I've explained what I can do within kind of mobilizing the limited privilege that I have from now being for the first time inside an institution, and try to mobilize that privilege to actually practice some of these things that I personally dream of: decentralization, of funding, and kind of sharing of resources in a way that money doesn't necessarily means power at all, and it's a kind of practice of shared trust and shared kind of resources. But I've seen it in other places around the world. So I'm from Lebanon, and Lebanon has like close to non-existent public and private funding for the arts, but they're incredible kind of initiatives that are very much anarchist and different socio-economical and socio-political formation in how people create together and rely on each other's skills and resources and reimagine creative industries. And they're incredible project. I'm not saying it's great not to have funding, but I'm saying that there are ways of people to reimagine how they work together in an equal way that doesn't rely on this hierarchy that money tend to bring.
Does anyone else have a question? We can keep going on this because there's a lot to say about money. Elaine. Wait for your mic so that everyone hears you. This way I don't have to repeat your question.
Hi. I don't know if this is off topic, but it just popped in my head. Can you comment on, there's a proliferation of professional development programs and platforms for artists, and it seems sometimes it's catered towards teaching the artists how to communicate better so that they could be accepted into a greater sphere. And I'm sometimes questioning how that's affecting the speech and the expression of the artists. Can you comment on that? Is it okay to comment on that for you?
Well, I think sometimes that's really targeted to being able to speak to the marketplace rather than to speaking to a broader public. And, you know, I think that that's a big piece of the question is like, we have to start talking about which audiences we're interested in connecting with and how and on what basis. Like part of, I mean, just as a practical matter, like part of the desire around opening a bar is to say, I don't want to limit who I'm interacting with by presenting this cultural work through a place that only a certain type of person will walk into, you know? And I think that there's a certain delusion that we have when we're inside of cultural institutions of the kinds of publics who will eventually come in, you know, and there's certainly a great desire to expand that, but there are limits, you know, they're just structural limits. Or I don't know, maybe Paul, you think something different about that. Not to put you on the spot. But I think this question of funding is super, just to go back to that for a second, because I feel like there were a number of other levels of things that you and I had talked about when we were preparing for this, which is, you know, related in part that like to how funding is typically distributed, you know, and the way that cultivation of funds then exerts power over what is produced in those spaces, barring any kind of intentionality. It's just like, it happens through this like sort of default way of working. And I think what we've seen a lot of also is cultural space kind of instrumentalizing the voices of artists as the speakers of the resistance, but like, it's okay because we have to allow for free speech. And yet, so, you know, there's and I think it's so important that classical cultural spaces kind of present challenging work, you know. I think the two things that most people want out of a cultural experience when they set out to have one is that they want to be either reflected in the work or somehow seen, their experiences, their life stories, or they want to be challenged, or they want to be like inspired, challenged. You choose the word. But those are like the two, you know, the two modes that people kind of come to art experiences from. And so how does that, you know, how does that manifest?
I just want to share, perhaps it's helpful, that as someone who worked in an international context, I've seen how different art policies affect how we create and how we're censored, actually. So I mentioned how in Lebanon, because it's non-existence, people find their ways to create outside of the norms, outside of the popular cultures. Every space you enter to, it's a total different new word, but it's also connected to the neighborhood around it, so it doesn't feel like an elitist space necessary. I've also created work in Germany, just been invited to or commissioned or being invited to do residency. And for those who don't know, the art policy there, like it is in other European countries as well, the budget comes directly from the cities, which is the also governmental budget. And you see how that end up actually, even though it's a great resource and there's so many artists who can survive, unlike here, for example, but you see how then censorship is directly used there, because if you end up being an artist who create work that is not aligned with the government current policies or interest or politics or geopolitics, it's very easily to be shut down and vilified, and the whole venue, whole festival being closed off. And there is danger in that. And in my view, I think probably because I'm the product of it for living like about a decade or more in UK and London, I found that the Arts Council policy, which is money coming from the government but being managed by an independent body, and they call it non-departmental public body, that's the Arts Council, has been quite significant for me. Like, I am the product of it because at any point of your career, you were able to apply for an independent body that doesn't abide by the fact that now there's a conservative government or there's a Labour government and they have different interests. You can apply every 6 months, actually, for either research or touring or production. And this allowed people from so many different milieus and different class and race and to actually create work. Obviously, it's not perfect because if you end up with a conservative government, you can also end up with cuts all over, and this will affect the art world. And we've seen also the lack of public debate about the fact that the Arts Council have, thrown money at marginalized and racialized communities as a way to kind of invest in them, but really ended up gentrifying a lot of neighborhood and made people further kind of alienated in where they lived. So there are issues in all art policies, but I in my humble experience being working in different places, I think kind of money from like kind of governmental money that it's managed by non-governmental body has been very helpful for people to
In that example, does the Arts Council, are those people working for like an NGO? It's basically an NGO. So like the equivalent here would be a nonprofit, or yeah. And so then it functions as a kind of granting body, yeah? Interesting.
Hi, thank you so much. We talked about censorship, but also talked about self-censorship. When I was posting my videos about Palestine, I had to sit down and put myself and be like, okay, there's going to be a price to this, and there's going to be doors that are going to be closed that I will never, about which I will never find out, and I'm completely okay with that. But I had to sit down and do that talk with myself. Are you ready for this? And I'm like, yep, I'm ready, because I cannot not do it. I cannot not go to sleep, and I cannot not go to sleep. Okay, so as an artist who is still kind of in that space of wanting to speak up, but then still like kind of talking about this risk of speaking up. Can you speak up? Because still I feel like I'm still not doing enough. I still can do more than I'm not doing. And why am I, even though I'm trying and doing stuff, why am I not doing more? Yeah, can you please talk about self-censorship and the risk that comes with not talking about it instead of talking about it? Thank you. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for sharing this. It's quite touching to hear, an artist kind of having this conversation with yourself. It just reminded me of what, this essay by Audre Lorde when she says, like, my silences did not save me and your silence will not save you. And it's something that I think a lot about recently. There are people, this is not the first genocide that happens to indigenous people. This is not the first time that we see state violence like that. This is the first time that we see it on our TV and we witness it as it happens. But it's not the first genocide in the world. And this conversation has been going on in creative field for a long time. Are we okay to be silenced about it? And what do we do when we're not silent about it? And it's hard to actually come up with a solution or expect everybody to be in the same place and in the same, whether bravery or whether kind of place. But I think it is time for us it's forcing us to rethink the oppression within the workspaces where we are. If those spaces who, as Laura mentioned, take a lot of pride or monetize the fact that artists are radical and artists are political and artists are, the kind of radical as just as a brand or as a cool thing to be, but actually when you act as you feel or as you believe, you act out your politics, this is when you're silenced. I think it's time for us to, as a community of artists, to rethink those spaces and actually force different ways of being within them.
Thank you, Tania. I just want to say it's really challenging, and the conversation you're having with yourself, I've also had with myself. On many different occasions in many different contexts, and I think that it's a sign of life and a sign of dedication to believing in something greater than ourselves. And I think that struggle is really important, and that we need to be willing to be in that vulnerable place together, because that's also a place of strength. So it's that double-edged sword of strength and vulnerability, and we also need to be here to hold one another, I think.
Hi, yeah, I have a quick question. Well, actually a long question. I mean, my question's quick, but the answers are going to be long. A number of times in recent years, there have been situations where the artist or the artwork goes against the feelings of the community, and so the community, in effect, becomes censors to creative production. That's like a really thorny issue for me. About, when community standards get used as a reason for censoring an artist, that's like a situation where I don't know which priority should come first or how. So I'm curious how you both work on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too complicated for me. I'll wait for you to answer. Can I answer? I would say that I thought a lot about this particular thing, and it depends on the artist and the community. Mm-hmm. I think, in the context of artists creating work that claims to be, let's say, against racism, and then a community of racialized people said, well, I think that this reinforces our dispossession. It reinforces our oppression. And I don't like seeing it. I don't like my family to see it. And we've seen this debate. I can give you so many examples, you know, like Exhibit B, for example, by Brett Bailey, who's a white South African artist who created a piece about slavery and positioned kind of black performers in cages. And he really started from a position of an anti-racist position. He is proposing that this, as a white South African, this is his history too. And he wants to discuss it, he wants to put it in front of people and say, this is what we've done with people. We treated them as objects, we've placed them in museums, etc. And when this piece toured, artists, community members, black community members said, no, you cannot do that. You have no right to do that. I don't want to see it. I don't want my family to see it. You are reinforcing those power dynamic within your workspace. And obviously the art world came and, you know, looked at a community of black people and said, how dare you silence art? This is such a I don't know, it's a Philistine way of thinking. And but for me as an artist, I feel that people come first before the art. That's how, like, it's very easy for me. Like, if I create work from a position of solidarity with people and these people tell me, no, this does not work, they come first, not the outcome, not the greater good of the artwork. This is how I deal with it. I feel that people and community come before art. Now, if it's a community who has already a lot of power and doesn't like the work because it exposes those crimes or that concentration of power, then it's a different story. It's no longer about solidarity, but it's about silencing evidence.
Yeah, and I think that was a really effective example, because what I was going to say is about that the essential piece of it are the power dynamics within who and how is being censored, right? Because we get all this conversation also around deplatforming and freedom of speech. And, you know, I don't have a problem saying, you know, well, the places that I control. So, you know, if you're some, like, fascist, I'm not going to let you have a platform in the spaces that I have a say over. Like, it's just a no-go for me. And if somebody wants to call that censorship, I'm fine with that, because I'm not interested. So that's just another facet to, I think, what Tania is saying, and it's about the power dynamics embedded in those different pieces of the conversation.
It is. Because, you know, I mean, this is what grows a lot. I mean, if we have a Trump tomorrow morning, we talk about a very high percentage of the society. So, again, treating also the society as, you know, we have to be critical also to them. That's, yes, I think, what something really never has to stop, you know. Criticizing our own practice and going back to the society and critically look at the society itself. Because in the end of the day, we have to decide what kind of society we want.
That's right, yeah.
And then also relates then within the culture.
That's right.
So this is kind of a circle, and, you know, can never really be separated.
Well,
so it's not a question, but...
But I also think that, I mean, culture is not divided from the society. It's all one thing. So, you know, it's that friction that happens between some forms of cultural production and the dominant power forces, right? Or the dominant culture, let's just say. And so that's where we get that friction, and that's, you know, that's a different conversation from the example that you gave about the white South African artist. And I think pain and, like, our feelings is actually something we need to get more comfortable talking about, because that's oftentimes what comes up when you have a profound cultural experience. There are feelings involved. It's not just some intellectual exercise. And that's a big component as well, that, you know, in addition to all of the other things that we're taught in this larger culture, in this dominant culture, is that those things don't matter as much as the intellectual pieces of the puzzle. And so that's excluded from the analysis of, you know, well, what comprises censorship.
I just have one more question about, like, a lot of First Amendment rights are, you know, at risk right now. We've talked about how fascism, et cetera, is encroaching on American free speech. And there is a piece of legislation that is now before Senate that would make certain speech that is thought of as anti-Zionist tantamount to anti-Semitic. So this will have far-reaching effects, not as far as speech, definitely art, everything. Do you think that that is the role of the artist to challenge that? And do you think that criminality and facing kind of a prison sentence or some kind of judicial punishment is paramount for artists?
I think it's about our collective freedom. I don't think it, I mean, I'm not sure that it's specific to artists. I think that that's something that as a society we need to resist if we are concerned with our collective freedom.
Right, but this is already cleared the House, the Senate, or sorry, the Congress. It's cleared. You know, there.
You mean if it passes, like, is it paramount for artists to go to jail because of it?
I think what we've seen collectively in America, especially this last 6 years, is that the right or the thoughts of the constituents are not something that is taken into account for our governing body, and it most likely is going to become a law that will be signed by a seated Democrat, President Biden. So yes, in the very, very, very real future of this being law, I'm asking your feelings on art and artists.
Well, hell yes. I think it's up to all of us. I mean, whether you're an artist or think of yourself as an artist or not, but I think we all better be out there confronting it, because otherwise we'll have to live with it. Maybe one more question.
Thank you, Laura. I will say one more. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I wasn't going to speak up because I feel like Barbara and Anne already know about this, but as an artist who is currently facing a felony for speaking on behalf of many, many movements, I just want to know what are ways you all can offer or know that post this decision, whether I'm convicted, that I can rehabilitate and restore some of my self now that I know that the freedom of speech that I thought was granted is not granted to me. To you. Yeah. And what ways or resources that exist or ideas that you can offer for someone, you know, or artists that are criminalized and successfully criminalized.
I think this is like, yeah, maybe Julie should speak to that, but you probably already in conversation with Julie?
No,
oh.
But we will be.
Okay, well, you need to talk to Julie, first of all. And second of all, I would say that I invite you to come to the Francis Kite Club and we can hang out and figure it out too. Because I think that we need to sit in community together. We need to negotiate our own trust relationships, you know, build those kinds of, I mean, I'm interested in doing that. So yeah, that's like an active invitation, you know, to do that. And you also need to talk to Julie.